As you know, Arlington County has really been a regional and national leader in advancing innovative and certainly integrated approaches to planning, transportation, and urban design. That commitment certainly continues today with an important planning and design work that is now underway supporting the implementation of the Columbia Pike Neighborhood Areas Plan through the proposed form-based code that our county board will consider this Saturday, and the important Realize Roslyn Sector Plan update, which is now underway and will really lay a foundation for the future of one of our county's gateway transit centers. Again, we're very fortunate this evening to have Christopher Leinberger with us. His program will focus on the urbanization of the suburbs and why Arlington is a national model and where do we go next. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce County Board Member Chris Zimmerman to introduce his good friend, Chris Leinberger. Thank you.
Good evening. Let me try that again. Good evening. Oh, okay, good. With the lights, I can't see all of you, so I got to be sure you're there. Thank you all for coming here this evening. I'm very excited, let me say first, that the folks at Arlington Planning are doing this series. I think that Arlington's tradition of thoughtful planning and thoughtful approach to policy generally is due in part to the fact that we're able to have good community conversations and to stimulate everyone's thought and involve everyone in the thinking. Back when I had started this job some years ago, the first time that I had the privilege to chair the county board was 1998. And you know, one of the things you get is an opportunity to put some initiatives forward. And I was interested in things that at that point this community was not talking about as smart growth or new urbanism, not having quite adopted the vocabulary at that point. And I talked about an idea for Arlington as the model for the new urban village. And then just getting the idea that urban was okay to talk about as part of our community was maybe a little bit edgy. Now, of course, we proudly proclaim that we're an urban community. But at that point, it was partly a matter of getting a conversation going about where are we going in the future at a time when it wasn't apparent where national trends were going in ways that now seem more apparent, and as you'll hear more about. And one of the things that turned out to be really useful that I got to initiate was a series of, a speaker series basically. And we did a series of forums that I called Urban Village Forums. And we had some speakers come about to talk about different issues that really are involved in this whole question of placemaking, very much like the topics being treated in this series. We got a fellow named David Sucher who wrote a book called City Comforts, which was sort of a kind of an urban village manual when, as I said, there weren't quite as many books on the shelf as there now are about these things. And then we had individual topics on things like streets and retail and how you got the development community involved in some of these things as well. So I think it's really appropriate and good for the community to kind of re-engage everyone in a conversation about this. And I'm very excited about the series that they've set up. Let me say, when you're doing this, if you're interested in having someone to talk about it from the perspective of a planner, there are now a lot of people who can address that, and they've got a really good one on the series coming up in a couple of months, I think. If you want an architect, there are quite a number of people who can do a really good job. They got one of the best coming, but there are lots of folks to do that. If you're going to talk about how you grow and develop, you can't really do that without talking about and to the people who actually do the development. And getting the perspective of the developers involved is a really important component and not always the easiest thing to do. If you wanted to set up a session about it from the perspective of development, from the development side, you might want somebody who actually has done development, who knows what it is to put projects together, and who's done it in an urban context and struggled with the kind of challenges of doing the kind of projects that we are looking for in Arlington. You might want somebody who has a national perspective and has looked at the data and the trends and understands what's going on in the broader picture and understands the market, some kind of market analyst or researcher. You might want an academic, somebody who's actually had to teach younger folks how to do this stuff and who's studied it from that standpoint. Maybe you'd go to a think tank or a university. And if you filled all those spots, and you might also want somebody who's an advocate, actually, who's been involved in kind of drumming up support and lobbying on legislation. And if you filled all those slots, you might have a pretty good panel with 4 people. Those slots wouldn't all be easy to fill, but I think it could be a good program. Or you could get Chris Leinberger to speak. And he is really the only person I know of who literally fills every spot that you might want. Chris has been a developer and in a number of different contexts, knows what it is to put together projects in places in different parts of the country. I think you've done some stuff in your native Philadelphia area at some point, out to New Mexico and other places. He's been involved in major development companies, serving on the board of several of those. But he also knows the research side, serving the business, because he headed up a company that is probably still, I think, the premier kind of real estate market analyst firm, Robert Charles Lesser Company, RCL Co., which he owned and sold a few years ago, but they're still going strong. And then he entered the academic world, and he's been visiting fellow at Brookings Institution and headed up a graduate program at Michigan before moving to George Washington University about a year and a half ago now, something like that. He's also an advocate and has worked to organize like-minded progressive developers around the country into a national organization called Locus, which, as it happens, is an affiliate of Smart Growth America, which means that, among other things, I'm going to get to be a colleague of his in a little bit here, too. So I think that we have with us tonight somebody who has looked at this from a variety of different perspectives that in many ways are different than most of the folks like me that you get to hear talk about this kind of thing from an environmental perspective or a planning perspective or an architectural perspective or an elected official's perspective. Chris has been doing a lot to share that and to organize people. He published a book a few years back called The Option of Urbanism, which I recommend to you if you haven't seen it. It's a different kind of take than a lot of the usual very good stuff that fill the shelves on our favorite subjects here, because of that perspective from the real estate side of things. So please join me in welcoming to our stage Professor Chris Leinberger.
Very gracious, and you all, of course, are going to be losing Chris, and I hope there's going to be many, many venues where you'll be able to share just how much he's meant to you, because I literally would not be here on this stage without Chris, not just because he asked me, but also because of the model that he's been instrumental. Not that it is, there's no great man theory of a history here, that he was here with you and with many of his ancestors that were working on this thing, the smart people that put the metro under Wilson Boulevard as opposed to down what was supposed to be a big wide Route 66. They made a phenomenal contribution, but Chris took advantage of it, and for 18 years I believe he's been, I count him among the top 5 local elected officials in the country. I've worked with a lot of them. He is truly at the top. So I know you're going to miss him, but thank you for sending him across the river. We certainly will make good use of him at Smart Growth America. So why I am here is because you've given me great food for my speeches throughout the country. You've given me great models that I've used countless times. I was on the phone with the New York Times today talking about Arlington as the model for suburban urbanism. Literally the model. My phrase is that if you don't understand Arlington, you don't understand the urbanization of the suburbs. And it's a critical trend. My research is showing anywhere from 50 to maybe 60% of all future development will be going to urbanized suburbs. and you are the national model. So the question is, where will you lead us next? And of course, that's in your hands more than anybody else's hands. But we really need you as this model. And I also am always reminded, of course, that as a model, you're always making this up as you go along, just as Indiana Jones did. And so you're, of course, allowed to stub your toes constantly. There's a great phrase that Harriet Tregoning, the head of planning in DC, says is, fail quickly. Try something new, fail, move on, try something else. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the built environment. Real estate, your homes, this building, the street in front of us, all of the infrastructure. When you add it all up, it's a minimum of 35% of the assets of the country. It is the largest asset class. And we in real estate are very proud of the fact that of the last 3 recessions, we've caused 2 of them. that we really can either take this economy down, but then when it comes back, we supercharge it. However, we haven't done this, you may have noticed, and that's because we're not engaged, because we're not building the walkable urban product the market wants. And you are, of course, just take a look at Wilson Boulevard and all the construction, that you are helping supercharge this economy, but the rest of the country is still learning how to do this. The key thing to know is of the 15 infrastructure categories, first among equals is transportation, because transportation drives development. And the transportation system you select as a governance, as a jurisdiction, will dictate what you can build. And if you just build freeways, we know what you get. You get the one way of building that the bulk of the country has been following for 50 years, drivable suburban places. But if you build a portfolio of different transportation systems, cars still very important, of course, but buses and rail transit and biking and, of course, walkability, you can then build the second way of building the built environment, which is walkable urban. Those are the only 2 options: drivable suburban, walkable urban. Within those 2 categories, there's vast variations, but those are the 2 basic concepts. So the corollary of transportation drives development is that you don't build transportation systems to move people. That's not the goal. For 6,000 years of building cities, the goal of building transportation systems is economic development. The means is by moving people. You learn that, or at least your ancestors learned that 40 years ago when they fought to put metro underground. And it drove the economic wonder, which is Arlington. Now, the thing about the country, of course, is that we did build walkable urban places in the 19th century, early 20th century. But then after the Second World War, we pushed the pendulum all the way over, and all we built was drivable suburban. The market wanted it. We in real estate responded. Obviously the National Highway Act was a great propellant of it. And we got really good at building drivable suburban places. And so you know how this laid out on the ground. We invented freeway. Well, actually, we copied it from Nazi Germany. We copied freeways. And we figured out how to build subdivisions. And then we invented the regional mall. This is King of Prussia Mall outside of Philadelphia, where I grew up. When I first went there, I thought I died and gone to heaven. We love this stuff. And of course, we got better at building freeways. This is Texas. They know how to build freeways. And we just kept on pushing out the development to the edge. So much so that for every 1% population growth, we've seen 6 to 8% land use consumption, otherwise known as sprawl. Now, there's a lot of unintended consequences of this experiment, and this was an experiment with drivable suburbanism. The world had never seen it in the 6,000 years that we've been building cities. And so to a certain extent, the novelty of it was part of its appeal. But when you do something new, you're not thinking of the downsides, you're thinking of all the exciting upsides. But we now know there's a lot of unintended consequences. And there's no conspiracy theory here. It's just we wanted it, we did it, and we just didn't figure out that there was any downside, but there is, and there's lots of them. But one, of course, is climate change. And that the built environment, our buildings and the transportation systems we use to get between our buildings, is responsible for 73% of greenhouse gas emissions. So once it's again legal in Washington to talk about greenhouse gases and climate change, we know that the built environment is going to be front and center. The thing, of course, by the way, keep in mind that almost all of the discussion in Washington back 3 years ago, you remember when it was legal to talk about it, that, oops, that was climate change. I'll get a study that'll prove that. The entire discussion was about supply efficiency. So adjust your lens tonight to think about the fact that demand mitigation is what we're really talking about as far as how we're going to really address climate change based upon the built environment. But I'll come back to that. And we also now know where the greenhouse gas emissions takes place. This is Chicago, and the city is in the blue in the center along Lake Michigan. And out the orange is, of course, those are the fringe suburbs. The city, that blue represents 2.5 tons of CO2 per year per household. The orange and red is 11.5 tons, almost 5 times as much. So we now know, and it's intuitive, where the greenhouse gas is being emitted. It's out on the drivable suburban fringe, and it's obviously quite logical. So what's happened and what you've taken advantage of, and what you represent as consumers, is that somewhere in the 90s we began to notice that the pendulum was swinging back as more and more people were demanding walkable urban places where they didn't have to drive everywhere. Not that they wanted to get rid of their car completely, but that they wanted the option to live in a walkable place, walk to restaurants, maybe even walk to work. And now the best way to see this, and this just demonstrates, I've got a couple students here tonight, they'll testify that I am one of the toughest professors they've ever had because I make them watch popular movies. And the most important one is Back to the Future, that 1985 classic. There's Back to the Future 1 and Back to the Future 2. They're great. They teach you a lot about urbanism. Back to the Future 3 is worthless, so don't even watch that. But what they showed in 1985 is this fictional town of Hill Valley. By the way, they use a technique that we in real estate employ as far as naming things. You name a project after what you destroyed to build on top of it. So Hill Valley, you take the hill, drop it into the valley, it's Hill Valley. And they show in Back to the Future 3 different times in Hill Valley's existence. 1955, downtown Hill Valley, 1985, Hill Valley, and the distant future. So we're going to see these clips because they show the entire evolution of our towns and cities in this country, and they got it dead on. So here's this great downtown, the plaza in front of the courthouse. You can get there by car, bus, bike, skateboard if you're Marty McFly. Pretty ideal. And the density there was probably an FAR, if you know what floor area ratio is, of about maybe 1.0, 1.5. So about 5 times more dense than suburbia. But even back in 1955, the seeds of change had been planted. This is a billboard that Marty McFly parked the DeLorean behind. That's the subdivision, that's advertising the subdivision that he was born in. So here is 1985 Hill Valley downtown, and it's obviously changed. So here he is, coming back to where he was.
Fred.
X-rated movie theaters, homeless on the
Great.
street. Behind the
Everything
homeless
was great.
was the
124.
plaza,
I still
which
got
had been
time.
paved over
Oh,
into a
gosh.
surface parking lot. So he went out to the new town center of Hill Valley, which is, what would it be? Bingo. By the way, you notice what it was named? That pine tree had to go. But now, in Back to the Future 2, he goes to this distant future, to downtown Hill Valley, and it's completely revived. It's come back to its grandeur, though obviously in a future context. And you'll notice that not only did they get that they got everything dead on except for one thing, which they never give us. They never give us the flying cars.
The future.
The plaza's back to being a walkable place. That distant future year was 2015 in the movie. We've arrived back to the future. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, why this has happened over the last 15 years, and we know who to blame. It's your kids. It's the millennials. They're the ones driving this. And probably the best way of understanding this is, of course, television. Television, Hollywood does more consumer research than any industry. And they put on shows that are really aspirational. So if you think about what the baby boomers were raised on, they were raised on, Leave It to Beaver and Dick Van Dyke and the Brady Bunch, all set in the suburbs. Back in the 50s, only 20% of us lived in the suburbs, but we were aspiring to move to the suburbs, hence Hollywood fed us that. So one of my favorites that I'd like to use is, of course, I Love Lucy, which this is in January, the third week in January of 1957, when Lucy, living in Manhattan, got it through her feather-brained head that she wanted to move out to Connecticut, out to the country. Listen to her reasoning. She has three reasons here. They still hold today about why people aspire to moving to the fringe as far as drivable suburban places.
Oh, Ethel, there's nothing like living in the country. Clean, fresh air, homegrown food.
Lucy, you're not thinking of moving, are you?
Why not? It'd be great for little Ricky. And Grace took us to see the most wonderful house that's for sale. A quaint old early American.
So here she's having second thoughts, looking out over the skyline of Manhattan, which is actually the back lot of Universal Studios.
Well, here we are. No more tears, honey?
Oh, no, I'm fine now that we're here. Gee, isn't this exciting? We're in our very own home. The first house we ever had.
So what she did in the following week's show is that she invited Fred and Ethel out to visit. 2 weeks after that, they moved out to Connecticut. I think you see where this is going. And what they discovered is one of the unintended consequences of drivable suburban. From an economic and quality of life point of view, as you build more, the quality of life declines. We didn't know this when it started, but the next subdivision gets built next to your house, the open space gets taken away, there's more traffic, there's more pollution, your kids can't leave their subdivision because they're going to get run over. And so the very reason you went out there gets destroyed. It also explains the most important political movement of the last generation, the rise of neighborhood groups. You gray hairs out there did not have, like I didn't, neighborhood groups growing up. We had PTA, we had Boy Scouts, we had church groups. We did not have neighborhood groups. Now every neighborhood in this country is organized, and they're organized rationally to stop development because of the more is less phenomenon. And now let's fast forward and think about what the kids grew up with. Obviously Seinfeld, and before that Cheers, but you know, Sex and the City and How I Met Your Mother, all set in walkable urban places. Safe, people that are delayed getting married, and they have a wonderful life in these walkable urban places. And Seinfeld, of course, showed it and continues to show it to this day.
Hey, have you noticed they moved where they do the interview on Jeopardy now?
Yeah, it used to be right in the middle of Single Jeopardy. Now they do it right after Single Jeopardy.
Yeah, it's much better, isn't it?
Oh, no comparison.
So it's the only show about nothing, but it really was about urbanism and creating a world that the baby boomers would never imagine, because 10 years before Seinfeld, we were watching Hill Street Blues, where if you went to an urban location, you were going to get killed. And 10 years later with Seinfeld and all the rest, it was urban is hip, urban is cool, urban is safe. So there's other reasons. You can't ignore the baby boomers. We will not let you ignore the baby boomers. But we're playing a secondary factor here. But we are, like all retirees, like all empty nesters, we downsize. And many, not all, are moving to walkable urban places. When you add up those two of the largest generations ever in this country, you look at the demographic impact. And back 50 years ago, 50% of households were singles and couples, 50% had children living in the households. That's what the baby boomer, that's how the baby boomers were in fact raised. Today, 75% of all households do not have children. They're singles and couples. They're the target market for walkable urban development, but if you walk across the Key Bridge into Georgetown, and you, of course, many of your neighborhoods here, you have a baby boom going on. So obviously, you know, it's not just singles and couples, but that is the target market. When you look at the future marginal growth in households in this country, only 14% of the net growth in households will have children living in them over the next 20 years. 86% will be singles and couples. The market's telling us something. Of course, there's also boredom. Most metro areas, you know, today even in this country, and certainly in Metro DC 15, 20 years ago, you had a choice of a single family home or a single family home. There was no choice. And the market demands choice. But really one of the most important things is that the creative class, which is driving this knowledge economy, is demanding walkable urban places. As the explosion south of Market in San Francisco, the move of Motorola and United Airlines and Boeing to downtown Chicago, the move of Google to downtown New York, down into the meatpacking district, even the movement of Quicken Loans to downtown Detroit, of all places, demonstrates the need for the knowledge economy to be in walkable urban places. The final reason is just sheer household economics, that the car has gotten so bloody expensive. It's pricing a lot of folks out of the ability to own a car. And 19% of the average household income goes towards maintaining or paying for transportation, almost all of it for cars. If you disaggregate the data, drivable suburban households, it's about 25% of all household income is for maintaining a fleet of cars. Walkable urban households, it's only 9%. The 16% delta is about $700–800 billion per year. The bulk of that money goes out of the local metropolitan area. It goes to Detroit, Tokyo, Stuttgart, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. If the walkable urban households, that money is reinvested locally. There's also just sheer consumer demand. There's been a lot of consumer demand work done on this. Long story short, about 30% of us want walkable urban. 40% of us want walkable urban in most metro areas. 40% of us want drivable suburban. 30% could go either way. But on the supply side, that's the issue. That even in DC, we probably have 20% of our households living in walkable urban places. In places like Atlanta, it's like 4 or 5%. So when you have high demand and low supply, you get, of course, pent-up demand. And when you have pent-up demand, what happens? Prices go up. So my research has shown that there's a 40 to 20%, 40 to 200% price premium on a price per square foot basis for walkable urban development in this country. And it's primarily because supply and demand are out of whack. And since we only add 2% to the built environment in a good year, it's going to take a generation to catch up. So what are we doing as far as driving? The amazing thing about driving is that in economics, there has been a rule of thumb that has stood for 100 years, that as GDP went up X%, the vehicle miles traveled, VMT, went up the same X%. If GDP went down 1%, vehicle miles traveled went down 1%. It was in lockstep. For 100 years, it was in lockstep until the mid-90s, where the VMT curve started to flatten out. And in fact, you've heard about about peak oil. And there's a great debate as to whether there will be peak oil or not. But I can guarantee you there is peak driving because we're past it. In this country, in absolute terms, in per capita terms, we are falling. We peaked in 2004. We are down 6% as a whole, but it's the young people. The young people peaked in 2001 when gas prices were $1 a gallon. In real dollar terms, going back, that's what we paid, baby boomers paid in the 60s. We paid $0.25 a gallon for gas. 2001, some of the lowest gas prices ever. And that's when the young people decided, those between 16 and 34, decided to start driving less. Since that peak in driving in 2001, they're driving 33% less in absolute terms on a per capita basis. From a social science point of view, that's falling off a cliff. Now, the thing about these walkable urban places that we need to build is that they're much more difficult to build. We in real estate, for the 50 years of the late 20th century, we got really good, or at least the best way that I can look at it, we got really good at driving NASCARs. NASCARs go straight or turn left. They're engineered only to turn left, which from a political point of view is somewhat ironic. And you drive 150 miles an hour. What we need to learn how to do, and what you as Arlingtonians and your city officials and your planning department needs to learn how to do, is fly fighter jets, which is you go straight, turn left, turn right, shoot up 5 miles or crash and burn in seconds going 600 miles an hour while you're being shot at. The complexity is many, many times greater than driving NASCAR. And we're still just learning this. We still have a lot of mistakes. We have to fail quickly. There's still a lot of things we have to learn. But the one thing that we have learned is that as you add more elements to a complex, walkable urban place, it generally just gets better. That the next condo down the street here in Roslyn, the next restaurant, the next hotel puts more people on the street. There's more economic activity. There's increasing economic viability. Rents go up, property values go up, property taxes go up. We start an upward spiral. More is better. However, the other thing is, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There is unintended consequences of walkable urban as well. And the main unintended consequence is we've got a massive affordable housing problem. And we have to change our affordable housing strategy in this country. It used to be, well, actually the current affordable housing strategy, even today, is, as you probably know, it as drive until you qualify. Just keep on driving out to Prince William County and you'll find something that you can afford. Of course, you're going to go bankrupt driving out there and back, and you're not going to spend any time with your family, and you're going to be contributing to climate change. You're going to be that 11.5 tons of CO2 per year. So we need a conscious affordable housing strategy. And as you'll see, you all are leading the way in that regard, but you've got a long way to go. So here's how the Metro Washington area lays out and your role within it. This is a study that we did at GW that was released last year, looking at the walkable urban places that play a regional role in the economy. There are 43 of these walkable urban places. We, for shorthand, call them walk-ups. We were calling them, walkable urban places, WUP. Shorthand became whoops. Somebody who was more creative than I said, that won't do from a marketing point of view, so they came up with walk-ups. And so here's downtown and Golden Triangle. That there are 6 types of walkable urban places. The first type is downtown. Second is downtown adjacent, surrounding downtown, like DuPont, like Foggy Bottom, where of course GW is, Capitol Riverfront, NOMA. Then there's urban commercial, Adams Morgan, Columbia Heights. These were local serving places, went downhill economically, are now rushing back as regionally significant walkable urban places. Then we move to the suburbs, because there's 3 types in the suburbs. And the first type are town centers that were 18th, 19th century town centers laid out before the car, a lot of historic buildings. They went downhill as well. They're now coming back, like Bethesda, like Clarendon, like here in Roslyn. They were those were the 2 town centers of this county. Then the biggie is the conversion of strip malls and regional malls into walkable urban places. There are 10,000 dead or dying regional malls and strip malls in this country, and they're being recycled. And what's been remarkable about Washington is that, Tyson's is repositioning itself. They're putting in the 4 metro stops. The property owners put up a third, over $1 trillion of money, over $1 billion. Sorry about that. I'm in Washington. Billion, trillion, same thing. They put over $1 billion to extend Metro out of their own pockets voluntarily. And why did they do it? They want to be like Arlington. I've heard that from property owners in Tyson's repeatedly. 25 years ago, Tyson's was up here. Downtown DC was down here economically. They're just reversed now. And so the property owners ponied up that money. And their model, I've heard it many, many times, is you, Arlington, what you've done. And by the way, the citizens around Tyson's, not all the neighborhood groups, but most of the neighborhood groups supported the tripling of density in Tyson's. And why did they do it? They want to be like Arlington too. That's why they did it. So the redevelopment of strip malls are a huge, huge future dynamic. And then finally, the 6th category is greenfield developments. Reston Town Center is the granddaddy of them all. National Harbor, we're not going to do too many of those. But actually, Crystal City is an example of that. Obviously, it was not done particularly well. It's being retrofitted right now, thank goodness. But it was a greenfield site development. That's the metro system. 80% of these 43 places are served by Metro. And of those 43 places, when you add up the acreage, it's 17,500 acres, which is 0.88 of 1% of the total land mass in the entire region. Keep that number in mind for a few more slides. So here, and we actually, with recent work, we've now discovered a 7th type, which we call urban universities. But again, there are 3 of these types in the suburbs. So this is not just the redevelopment of our center cities, it's the urbanization of the suburbs. And of course, Arlington. I mean, you've probably seen this slide. I of course stole it from Chris. So, you know, here is Clarendon, and here is the 1980 Sears store, and here's the shot from the same perspective today, with the Apple Store, Whole Foods, restaurants, and $600 per square foot condos on top. The thing is that 2 blocks north and 2 blocks south of this place, you see that it goes back to single family. And in fact, the most expensive single family housing in Arlington is within walking distance of your walkable urban places. Why is that so? Because they can live in suburban splendor and walk to great urbanism. They have the best of 2 worlds. My research shows that those places that are near great walkable urbanism get a 40 to 100% price per square foot price premium because of that best of 2 worlds. The other thing is that your walkable urban places take up 10% of your land mass as a county. 25 years ago, that 10% of that land mass, because it looked like on the left, netted or resulted in about 20% of your total county tax revenues and falling. Today, it's almost 55% of your tax revenues. You've pushed your tax base onto 10% of your land, and many of those people that are living in that 10% are renters or condo owners. And guess what? Most of them don't have kids, but they do pay school taxes. As a result, you have some of the best schools in the country. That's one of the major reasons why you're a model and why people perk up their ears. The other thing that you've done that they love to hear about is that you've, of course, quadrupled the development on that 10% over the last 25 years. Your absolute car counts on Wilson Boulevard are flat or slightly down. Virtually everybody that is going to work or living in that 10% they get around by biking, walking, or metro. Downtown White Flint is, of course, following you. They're using you, but of course, they don't say that they like to be like Arlington. They say that they like to be like Bethesda. So this is, I'm not quite certain why I'm showing you this, but anyway, let me show you the growth of Metro and how remarkable it's been since it opened in 1978. And then here it is in 1986 as we continue to invest in Metro. This is just really remarkable, and particularly the Orange Line. The Orange Line is the most important rail line in the country. Why is that so? Because you can learn the best lessons of how to build walkable urban in Arlington and the worst lessons when it goes into Fairfax County. Because they went and they put it exactly where DOT wanted to put it 40 years ago, in the right-of-way of Route 66, where the most valuable real estate, the stuff within walking distance of the station, you can't get to because you'll be run over. And so the only economic development activity until very recently has been park and ride surface parking lots. So of course, what do they do with Route 6 or with the Silver Line? Now they obviously looped through Tyson's, which was just very important. But phase 2, what is it? Right down the tollway, not learning the lessons of the Orange Line that was right in front of them. Here's 1999, again, continued expansion. We continue to invest in Metro, and here it is in 2010. So how have we built here? Over the past 4 real estate cycles, 24%, in the 1990s, or the past 3 real estate cycles, in the 1990s, 24% of our development in this region went into walkable urban places. In 2000s, it was 33%. And in this real estate cycle, it's roughly 50%. This, again, this is only regionally significant places. This ignores bedroom communities. If you add in bedroom communities, I'm guessing That adds another 30%. So in this real estate cycle, my estimate is that 80% of all real estate development is in walkable urban places. Again, that 50% went to less than 1% of the land, and probably that 30% that is local serving probably went to 4 or 5% of the land. So we're just building on a very small fraction of the entire region. We don't need to add another acre to this region. Of course, we have price premiums. Here is office price premiums of 75%. You know, of course, about the housing price premiums. And again, gentrification. Most of this is because we don't have enough supply. But let me just show you what it can do to climate change. That the chart on the left, the little thermometer on the left, is what the BTUs of a drivable suburban household is. And it's, you know, it's about 640,000 BTUs per year per drivable suburban household. That reflects what you saw with that map of Chicago earlier. If you move that drivable suburban household, move it over 2 columns to the walkable urban, you reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. And if you move them into a green house in a walkable urban condition, you decrease their greenhouse gas emissions by 75%. So again, what I said earlier, that the built environment is responsible for 73% of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you move people from the fringe to Arlington, you're going to cut their greenhouse gas emissions by between 50 and 75%. This is obviously the #1 way we're going to address climate change. The country right now is we have been dropping for about 8 years as far as greenhouse gases, believe it or not. We're down to about 1996 levels. Part of it was the recession, but we've continued going down. Part of it is the conversion from coal to natural gas and fracking. But when we really do the research, I believe, we don't have the evidence yet, a lot of it is because of the walkable urban trend that's taking place. So the question are, what are the lessons that you've taught us so far? I try to categorize, what have you done that I'm taking across the country in speeches and in research to show other people what they can learn from you? And the first, of course, is that if you're going to put in rail transit, put it underground. It works best because you get 360 degrees of economic development. In Tyson's, they're going to get 180. It's only going to go on one side of that elevated track. For all time, they're going to miss out on 1/2 of the economic development potential. You're taking advantage of all 360 degrees. It costs more to put it underground, but you're making a whole lot more money long term as those tax records show. Number 2 is you've got to make the right thing easy. You put overlay zoning on top of all those station sites with strict boundaries. You drew lines and said, don't even think about going outside these boundaries. Inside the boundaries, high density. Outside the boundaries, it goes back to single family. You measured, you listened, and you analyzed. You've been spending about $500,000 per year in this county doing research, understanding where you're going, getting feedback, doing consumer studies. It takes that kind of analysis, especially when you're out there pioneering like you've been. You've insisted on mixed use, and you've backed it up by the research. I've seen a number of examples where Chris Zimmerman would beat up a developer and say, damn it, put office into that mixed use project, even though they didn't want to. They did it. They were pleased as punch. They made a fortune doing it. It filled up at record rents. They probably didn't thank you, but they did by paying some phenomenal taxes. But it needs to be mixed use. It cannot be a monoculture like Golden Triangle is in DC, which is all office space. You started on the affordable housing strategy before it was perceived to be an issue, and you stuck with it in good years and bad. You've made cash contributions to your affordable housing fund, even in bad years. That's almost heroic. Now, given the need, I'd only grade you B+, but everybody else is C, D, and E in this country. You're leading the pack. You've got a lot more to go because you're barely holding on to the affordable housing that you have now with the investment that you're making. Walkable urban development, you've shown absolutely and on a per capita basis has reduced your traffic. That's just a killer thing. And it's reduced your need for parking. That everybody used to build, with retail, 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail. Actually, sometimes 5 and 6 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail. You're finding that it's going down to 2 parking spaces per 1,000, 1 parking space per 1,000. You're driving down the parking ratios because so many people are getting there by walking and by bus and by biking and metro. The other interesting thing is that walkable urban development leads to growing Democratic Party majorities. And the best summary of that, the best line I've heard was former Congressman Tom Davis, who was fighting the Vienna Transit-Oriented Development Project by saying most aptly that people that live there do not vote for people like me. I don't think we know why Democrats tend to be concentrating in walkable urban places. We can have a lot of hypotheses about it, but it's not been proven. But it sure seems to be happening. You've also shown us to focus on the cores first, and then the corridors come along. That most of your cores are approaching build-out. There's still stuff to build. But a lot of this real estate cycle, you've been seeing Wilson Boulevard being built out, connecting the cores. And you've also shown that bus-based and car-based walkable urban places can be made to work. Shirlington is a great example of that. Now, not even Arlington is perfect. Only Buddha is perfect. Roslyn and Crystal City. Now, we all know they're easy to hate, they're easy to make fun of, but in the 70s, you were making mistakes that nobody else was thinking of trying to make. And you now have a chance to change it, and you are. Crystal City in particular, but also Roslyn. You are making some pretty noble strides to retrofit these places. You've been late to the game in understanding the importance of place management. Place management is best done by the private sector. Generally, it takes the form of business improvement districts. They pay for it. So I would urge you to continue. Place management is a missing level of governance in our society. And we are seeing place management blossom throughout the country. You need to encourage that, which means that the county supervisors and the county staff are going to have to delegate down to the place management folks to have them do more and more, take on more and more responsibility for the management of these places. Unanchored corridors need rail transit and overlay zoning as well, and the biggest example of that, of course, is Columbia Pike. You must build the streetcar. It is critical if you want to see that place blossom like it needs to blossom. Having said that, you also have to really double down on the affordable housing program. Private sector, you've not been successful in getting the private sector to pony up some money to help pay for this stuff. 100 years ago, 80% of all rail transit in this country was built by and operated by real estate developers to get their customers to their property because their property values went up, allowing them to subsidize the rail transit. We need to take that approach again to get the private sector to pay for a portion of the rail transit. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, affordable housing is still a crisis in this town and getting worse to a certain extent. And you never got the skins here. Actually, that was a fabulous thing to do. Football is, I played football in college, and from an urban point of view, it's worthless. So good for you. So besides correcting your shortcomings, what will you teach us next? I want to end with this. The need for lateral rail transit to connect the radials coming out from downtown, kind of like the Beltway became with cars. Every metro area is going to put in what in Atlanta they're calling the Belt Line. The Belt Line in Atlanta is the most important rail transit project in the country, and it's a circular belt line connecting their 4 radials of their MARTA system. You're going to put one in as well. The Purple Line is the first down payment of that over in Maryland. Place management, your services and roles they're going to take are going to expand phenomenally. They're going to get into parking and managing all the parking in each of these walkable urban places. They're going to manage every one of the parks in these walkable urban places. They're going to brand these places distinctly. They're going to engage in economic development, workforce training, affordable housing. They're the best ones to do the affordable housing. This is a devolution of county services down closer to the people in these, on average, 300 to 400 acre places. The strong place managers are going to adopt local serving places. They've got the overhead, they've got the skills. They can adopt a walkable urban neighborhood nearby and provide those services by leveraging their neighborhoods or their skill sets. You're going to start closing off streets for only pedestrians. And I know what you're thinking. 30 years ago, we tried it, and that failed. It's because we thought of it as a silver bullet, as a one solution that'll take care of it. We all know, and any of you know that has traveled to Europe, they work beautifully. Once you have the walkable urban in place, once you have the mixed use in place, then the streets begin to close. It didn't make sense when we had dead and dying downtowns to close the streets. So you're going to be coming back to closing streets here in Arlington over the next 20 years. You have to rationalize, pull out, underground, or deck the highways between you and the Potomac. They are some of the most underutilized highways, separating you from a golden asset, which is the river. We have no shortage of land in this country. Having access to river is the most valuable, or to water, is the most valuable real estate there is. And you've separated yourself by those silly freeways. You're redeveloping these soulless places, of course. And if you get a little down about how long it's going to take, remember the great Garrison Keillor phrase that in the long run, all solutions are temporary. You'll do it. And put in the landing facilities for flying cars whenever they get here. But do keep in mind, this is not just for your quality of life. This is crucial for climate change. What you're doing in Arlington is the most important thing as far as addressing climate change. And that this density, this walkable urbanism, this multiple transportation types is how we're going to dig ourselves out of this ditch. And you're leading the way. So the niche, walkable urbanism, when you guys got into it 20, 30 years ago, was considered a niche market. We now know that walkable urban is the market as the country is witnessing peak sprawl. And thank you, Arlington, for being the national model. Keep it up.